As a culture, as a society, we go in phases. And so for a while, right when Instagram came out and we're looking at Instagram feeds, these polished feeds were just something we hadn't seen in real life. So we were enthralled by that. But then you get used to it and you start to see the cracks in that. And then Netflix documentaries come out about how that mom you looked up to is actually a wild abuser. You know what I mean? And so we distrust. And so we learn. And I think it's become really refreshing over the years when people open up to that, because it makes us feel like we're not failing.
Welcome to the Entrepreneur Podcast, filled with marketing and leadership tips on launching and growing your business with your host, Deanne Mora.
Today on the podcast, we're diving into a topic that's rarely discussed, but powerfully transformative: how your biggest failure can become your greatest business asset. My guest is Melissa Monty, host of the top-ranked podcast Mind Love, with over 5 million downloads and listeners around the world tuning into her raw, unfiltered insights on personal growth and authenticity. She shared stages with names like Pat Flynn and Gordon Harbinger, been featured in Forbes and Harper's Bazaar, and was named Podcast of the Year in 2022. But Melissa didn't build her empire the traditional way. In fact, her journey started with a felony charge for someone else's crime, a moment that would have ended most careers before they began. Instead, she turned it into the foundation of a thriving brand. Now, Melissa's here to talk about the psychology of truth-telling, how vulnerability builds trust, and how proprietary frameworks that help entrepreneurs turn personal trauma into scalable impact. Now, if you've ever struggled with how to share your story or wondered if you should hide the hard parts, this conversation will change the way you think about personal branding, leadership, and what it really means to connect. Melissa, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you for having me. I'm honored to be here.
So, Melissa, obviously we've sparked some curiosity with that introduction, and you said that your criminal record became your credibility. Can you walk us through the moment that you realized that your worst moment could actually be your biggest asset?
I don't think there was one single moment that I realized this, but what I did know is I spent years trying to hide parts of myself. I actually went back and forth depending on my mood. I've always kind of been an oversharer, but I didn't know how to use that for connection. I used it more as armor. So sometimes I would share, I have a felony, just as a shock factor at a party, for example, but it kept people at arm's length. And I was lying to myself in a way, saying, well, I'm just an open book, wondering why certain friendships even felt difficult, why I tended to repel certain people. But when I was building my life and trying to figure out what I was going to do with everything, I always recognized, I fairly early on recognized that this big thing that happened to me actually closed a lot of doors. And so it only left entrepreneurship in my mind. I did expect myself to have some sort of success in my life. And so I wasn't the kind to be like, well, I guess I'm just going to have to start at a minimum wage job. I started thinking outside the box, and I thought, well, how can I find success with no one else's permission? Because I can't explain the crazy story on 2 lines of a job application. And I started teaching myself internet marketing, and things just sort of unraveled from there. The first couple of months that I was studying internet marketing online, I won tickets to a conference. That conference had a contest also. I ended up winning the Wicked Smart contest at the end, which set up my freelance career. I still got jobs because I was intelligent and I was I was out there in different areas, like at internet marketing conferences and things like that. I wasn't just hiding away. And so little by little, though, I started to notice how my relationship with my biggest shame started to evolve. And so what I realized mostly was that even if I could say it out loud, there was something about really understanding how to share my story from a place of empowerment, not from a shock factor, not from just trying to have the best story at the party, but actually, like, how am I going to share this on a podcast? How am I going to share it with potential clients if it comes up? Like, what does that look like for me? And through that process of really understanding how to tell it, I healed a lot of parts of it. And I started to realize that it's really difficult to build a future when you're rejecting parts of yourself that make you whole. And so I brought those in and I started sharing about it. And even though my story is highly specific, not a lot of people have ended up with a felony for somebody else's crime, but people did understand the meaning underneath that, the thread that brings it all together, like losing yourself in relationships, low self-worth, ignoring red flags. And so when I learned how to distill the specifics into the common themes, that's when people started leaning in and asking me questions. And I realized that I was building trust with people I had never even met.
It's interesting because I talk to a lot of leaders about their personal brand, and there's always this balance of, well, do I talk about my family? Do I talk about my hobbies? Do I talk about, where do I draw the line between personal and professional? And, even on LinkedIn these days, I think we're seeing that there's, many more personal perspectives are coming out than, it used to be a very corporate feeling platform. And, that it seems like it's shifting. So, I know that a lot of entrepreneurs feel like, they need to be just this polished brand in order to be marketable, but clearly you've done the opposite. So why do you believe that the opposite is actually true?
This comes from a few different prongs, but one of them is that as a culture, as a society, we go in phases. And so for a while, right when Instagram came out and we're looking at Instagram feeds, these polished feeds were just something we hadn't seen in real life. So we were enthralled by that. But then you get used to it and you start to see the cracks in that. And then Netflix documentaries come out about how that mom you looked up to is actually a wild abuser. You know what I mean? And so we distrust. And so we learn. And I think it's become really refreshing over the years when people open up to that, because it makes us feel like we're not failing. So at first we're fascinated, but then we cannot help but look at all the polished accounts online and think, but how come I can't do that? And we can only feel that so long. We can only feel the awe so long before it starts coming back and we relate it to ourselves. And so I think that that's happened on such a scale because of how much time we're spending online, that it's really nice to just see the mom account who says, okay, yeah, where I film my recipe videos, this looks perfect, but let me turn the camera around and there's toys all over the place, Like we want to see that because that person is being real with us. And so then when they make us a promise, we can actually trust that promise.
Yeah, it's that relatability. So it's like, it's like when you think about video, like, sure, if on your website, put a really corporate looking video, because people know they go to your website and they know it's going to be kind of corporate. It's not really you. But why did they go to social media? They go because they want to see what's under the covers. They want to understand kind of what's can I really relate to this brand? It sounds like that's what you're suggesting here.
Yeah, definitely. And when we can see ourselves in people, we're more likely to follow them. And so how relatable is perfect? It's not, because none of us have accomplished it. And so even when we see that online, we're wondering when the shoe's going to drop. It's just really difficult to trust. But also, when somebody meets you with their vulnerability, what most people may or may not realize that they're actually looking for isn't necessarily if something's perfect, but it's the lesson underneath that. Even if you're following somebody that doesn't have such a personal story, but maybe they failed at their first business. Maybe they're like, well, I don't want to show that because I just want to show that I made $1 million with my second business or my third business. So I'll just only show that. But most people have been trying a while. And so when they're look at somebody and they're like, well, I don't know how to do that. I wasn't successful the first time. Maybe this person is just different than me. It reminds me of, for a time in my early 20s, I volunteered at the Suicide and Crisis Counseling Center. And even though this might seem unrelated, it taught me a lot in how I relate with people. And one of the things is, if somebody comes to me with a crisis and I say, "Oh, I just did this and it worked out fine," or "I dealt with that too and this is what I did," the person having the crisis isn't hearing, "Oh, cool, somebody is showing me the way out of this." They're hearing, "I can't get there, but this person can." And so it's increasing how unrelatable it is. And what you do on the other end of that phone is, I would ask that person in crisis questions to eventually guide them to their own conclusion. That's also what business and life coaches do, and good therapists. They ask the right questions to get you to create those neural pathways in your head. And so in that same way, if I just show up with my brand new business, everything's worked out for me the whole time. People want somebody that understands how to deal with failure. People want somebody that knows what they're feeling inside when they feel like maybe they've made the wrong decision for the last 7 months and they wasted all their family's money. They need somebody that can guide them through the mud instead of just showing them this path that they feel like they can't climb.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. I mean, when you think from a marketing perspective, when somebody sees your brand, what's the number one thing that they want to feel? It's like, you get me. You understand where I'm at. You're able to meet me where I am. And you're right. If you're this polished, something on a pedestal, as a whether it's a personal brand or a business brand, how can your audience possibly feel like you get me? Right? They can't. They can't. Now, you actually have a methodology that you've called Story to Scale. Could you talk a little bit more about that and how it helps to entrepreneurs who maybe have gone through? And, obviously your situation is, I kind of feel like you're a great example because, if you can overcome that from a personal branding perspective, like whatever else, skeletons that the rest of us have in our closets, that seems pretty minor in comparison. But, everybody has something, right? It's some failure, some feeling of inadequacy, something that didn't quite go according to plan. So how do you guide entrepreneurs on how to turn that into an engaging story?
Yeah. So the thing about my method is, I didn't reinvent the wheel, but I did add a layer to it that I know from a very unique perspective that I have from being in marketing for 20 years and understanding that people aren't moved through logic. Apple did this really well. They didn't sell you the features of their phone. They sold you an identity. Their first big commercials that took off were what it looked like to be trendy, holding this thing, what it looked like in your lifestyle so you could picture yourself within that. And so when we are selling somebody an identity, we're really getting to the root of how they're going to feel when they make these changes. So it's all about coming to that underlying meaning, like I talked about before. Because again, a lot of us are like, well, how is my story relevant? How maybe other people haven't gone through this exact thing. It doesn't matter. It's really the meaning underneath. And so when I guide people through these 7 steps, what I want to get from them is, first, where did you start? This is what I call your algorithm. And so these are the unconscious beliefs that you've either inherited, you heard too many times when you were a kid. And so as a side note, when I'm working with people with story, there's really 2 people that are coming to me. Oftentimes it's people that are like, what was I given this whole story for? I have no idea what it means. And they're using their story to kind of guide where their purpose is. And then the other side, which is the more common, are the people who might have an idea, or maybe they have a few ideas. Maybe they even already have a business and they're trying to map their story to that. And so you can either start just the broad with these questions, answer it from every area that comes up and start to find the themes, or you can look at it through one specific lens. Like, okay, I have a business helping people gain visibility online, be seen online. So how did that start? What was my relationship? What was the algorithm around being seen, for example? And so this algorithm is really, what were you taught about X? The business that you're working in, it could be success, love, worth, identity. What were all the recurring experiences that shaped your beliefs about yourself? Then part 2 is the disruption. This is the shock that breaks the loop. And so what moment, or maybe series of moments, made you realize that something wasn't quite what you thought? If somebody had asked what just happened in that moment, how would you explain it? And so for me, that algorithm was a culmination of being bullied, of feeling like I couldn't get a boyfriend at a certain age, and then one of the big disruptions. There were a couple of them in there, but one was a sexual assault and one was the arrest later on. And so these were both things that kind of broke what I was thinking and went down another path, which leads to step 3, which is the awakening, seeing the pattern for what it is. So this is when the fog lifts. Maybe at first you don't realize what that disruption just created. You just know nothing's the same from now. But the pattern is looking back, seeing that I was losing myself in all of my relationships, seeing that I didn't know how to say no, seeing that the patterns that led me to where I was. Then is the resistance. This is step 4. This is that battle between old and new. This is where people tend to live the longest. How often do you realize, okay, maybe I need to stop scrolling my phone the last hour before bed, but it's really hard to break that habit. Maybe it takes you years until something happens and you're like, no, I'm finally ready. I'm not going to live in this weird in-between anymore, which is step 5 is the choice. This is the moment that you commit to change. So what was the exact moment that you decided to change for real? What actions proved to yourself that this time was different? Step 6 is the embodiment. This is where change meets action. You're not just thinking differently. You're actually being different. You feel the shift in who you are. Now, step 7 is what most heroes' journeys skip. And this is the gold. This is what really brings everything together. This is the wisdom that you gained from that. If you became a teacher from that series of life events, what are you here to teach? And so looking back, what was the story really about now that you see it from a bird's eye view? How does this experience help you help others? What's the one sentence of wisdom that this journey gave you? And so this might sound like a really transformational journey, and it is, but even people like Russell Brunson use something very similar where he calls it his epiphany bridge story. And so when he tells you how to tell a story about how you started internet marketing, for example, or his big things is funnels, he takes you through this journey of what his life was like, first with the internet, trying to get people. Maybe he was sending all these emails, and then emails stopped working and Google changed his algorithm. Then there was a big disruption. What made him realize there might be another way? And so you can see this through a very business lens too, or you can literally look at your life story and say, what has the universe been giving me over and over again? Because there's probably something here for me.
It's interesting as I'm listening to your approach. I'm actually reflecting just to show that there really is a good business parallel here. I'm reflecting on being part of a pitch deck competition. I was a judge. I wasn't fortunately I didn't have to pitch anything. I think we put those four founders through hell, but we were, the founders were guided to basically use a story arc or use the hero's journey in order to pitch their business. So it's that foundational, because, as from the time that we're infants, we are wired to listen to stories, and what makes those stories engaging, what makes a good novel engaging, and then what makes your business pitch engaging. And then, so it sounds like what you're using some parallels here to, you're pulling people through that story in a way that, makes their personal story make sense and relatable and be engaging. Does that sound right?
Yes, exactly. And what we're doing is we're creating resonance with the audience. And so when you can tell the story in such a way, and there is an art to this, for example, we learn the difference between trauma dumping and telling a story. What a lot of people ask me about is like, how much do I actually share about my story? And it reminds me of how in maybe a movie you might see this couple get married, for example, and they're super happy at their wedding. And then maybe the wedding night, there's something that happens and he like flinches and pushes her back. And a good example of this is if you've seen it starts with us, or as it ends with us, one of those with Blake Lively. And you see it and you're like, oh, but maybe that was a fluke, but it's foreshadowing in the future. And then it cuts to maybe 7 years later and she's got a bruised face and she's hiding away and he's a full-blown alcoholic. You don't need every detail of what happened between those 7 years, but you fill it in with your mind with the right cues. And so you can do that with the hard parts of your story also, if you have a really deep, dark story that goes along with it. I have to do that with several parts of mine. There's one line that captures the depth of it that might bring people there, but just enough that they can recover and I can pull them out through it. Where you really go into the details is often the moments of clarity. It could be, I worked with a client who, her deep moment that she really went into visceral examples and details about was actually the moment that she was sitting in her car, gripping her steering wheel, and she just couldn't get herself to go into her real estate job. And she was feeling her heart palpitations, and she goes really deep. And that brings people in that are having regrets about their job, wondering, how am I ever going to get out of this? Is it too late to start over? And so you make people feel that moment of realization. And so there's an art to how you tell a story that makes them feel with you. And what happens is you bring them into the feeling, so they're resonating with you. And then you begin to pull them out with your story of hope. And so they want more of that transformation. And you're the only person that made them feel enough to bring them there. And they trust more that you're going to help them feel their way out of it too.
Well, this is your expertise and not mine, but isn't there an actual psychological tenet that our memories are rooted in emotions? So when you think back to your childhood and all the memories that you have, there's typically some strong emotion associated with each of those memories. So it kind of, if you're thinking of yourself as a personal brand or a business brand and you're trying to be memorable, then creating that relatability with an emotion. I mean, now we're talking about marketing psychology, really is what we're getting into, right? But that, creating that emotional connection can help anchor your brand, be it personal or business, in your audience's mind, I'm assuming.
Yeah, and that's exactly why the phrase exists. People won't remember what you did. They'll remember how you made them feel. And that's why this has become such a theme in my life, is because I understood this through multiple lenses. Like I said, 20 years of marketing psychology, 550 interviews of neuroscience on behavior change, and then this weird obsession that I've had for about 25 years of my life of understanding actually religion. I was raised in a religion that didn't feel right later on. And I always had that pullback, but what if I end up in hell? What if I end up in hell? And so I would do this little prayer to just make sure. And it fueled this need to understand where Bible stories came from, why many of these stories actually originated thousands of years before, but were just credited to the Bible. What Greek mythology understood. And what I found is that even in ancient history, we've always understood story as an almost consciousness technology for change. And when we started to create literalism around religions, we lost a lot of that understanding. That actually didn't even happen until about 300 years after Jesus died, that we started creating biblical literalism. And so this has always existed. We've always understood it from different lenses. And it's almost as though the marketing psychology is helping us rediscover what we knew previously.
Interesting. I could go on for hours and hours on that topic, but I know there was a 5-minute story structure. Is this the same one? You hit a million downloads in your first year. So what was the secret sauce to getting there?
There's a lot of secret sauces to getting to a million. Part of it is just training your brain to look outside the box, stop following what everyone else is doing, and understand what moves people to action in general. So I did everything from going into WeWorks, and while there were we were having fires around LA and capitalizing on that. What do people want right now? I went and got all of the smoke masks, brought it to floor 2 and said free smoke masks on floor 2. And every time somebody would come, I would have them subscribe to my podcast. I would show them how to leave a review. And this sounds like silly little things that may or may not have moved the needle.
It's absolutely grassroots.
It opened my brain to training it to spot possibilities. It put me out there, got me used to speaking about my stuff. And so I was constantly telling people about my podcast, which also changed the way that I told about it because I'd see people's reactions and I would make small shifts. And so that in combination with a really powerful story, when people find out that I'm not just somebody who's just growing a podcast, but they know what I've been through, people rally to help. They want to be part of that movement. And so the trick is around understanding how to create a movement. How do you reach the people who need the same kind of help that you needed? How do you reach the people who have resources to help? Thinking in all of these different ways got my mind to even think about, okay, well, it's always coming back to your audience. Where are people discovering podcasts? Word of mouth within podcast apps? Which ones have their own featured sections? How do I get in there? And which leads to the question, how do I build relationships with everybody working for this app? All right, who are the people that create that featured section? What makes them stand out? What are their main goals with their job? And so it's the same idea that comes back when you're telling your story. Am I telling this in a way that's feeding my ego and only my goals? Or am I actually thinking about what does the person hearing this need? And so if you can teach yourself to do that in every facet of your business, you will see things and have ideas that you wouldn't otherwise. And it's something that continuously fuels my work. Even now, I wrote a book. And so my first thought when I'm trying to bring in an agent is I need to know how to make his job easier. And then who's he pitching to? I need to know how to make their jobs easier. And so when I came with my book, not only did I have a marketing plan, how many connections I had. So it's really always thinking about the person listening or the person that's ultimately going to be serving you. How do you serve them first?
That's great advice. And so when you're working with a client, are they coming to you and they say that it's like, oh, I heard your podcast, whatever, like you have trauma, I have trauma, let me lay my trauma on you and then tell me how to make me marketable? Or are you pulling that out of them? And what is your process for doing this with a client?
There's a couple of ways. Oftentimes people are referred to me, but when they're coming to me for the first time, it's just like with anything else. People want to be heard. That's even what a good sales call is. And so if somebody just came to me and I hadn't heard anything about them and I said, I know I can help you. I do know I can help them, but everyone thinks their situation is unique. And so they need to be fully heard so that then I can actually digest it and think, I can help you and I can actually see exactly where this is going to go. People want that kind of confidence. But when I'm working with them, I actually have a group program where we all work together, which ends up really inspiring people even more because they start to realize the common threads in their very different situations, whether they are just working on, their biggest hardship was not getting a job versus losing a baby or something like that. Like the very different things, you can find common threads in that. And so when you do that, the group environment really does help people to see, wow, we all have so much more in common than I'm letting my mind think, because we all want to think that we're different. And so we work through the stages together. And then I've developed custom AI tools that just help to bring it out more refined sooner. But it's very important to me to teach people how to do it manually so that we don't rely on the AI too much. But it is there for those who feel like they aren't a good writer at all, and it's hard to even get one sentence out. So it ends up being a really great hybrid way to work with anybody, regardless of where they're coming from.
Interesting. Well, let's dive a little bit more into marketing psychology. That's an area I'm personally passionate about. I think it's so fascinating. And I know that you talk about the neuroscience of trust and flawed story. So let's get into the science a little bit. What happens in our brains that makes vulnerability so powerful as a marketing tool?
Our defenses actually drop when we see somebody else being vulnerable. And oftentimes, especially when we think somebody's going to sell us something, we put a guard up. I mean, walk into a car lot and notice what's happening in your body, for example. Or say somebody is offering some free resource that also requires a sales call, and you're like, I know I'm not going to buy this. You are made of stone on the other end. But when somebody leans in and they're actually telling with authenticity, speaking with authenticity, trying to relate, asking you questions, our mirror neurons fire up and we'll match that vulnerability even if we're not saying anything. So we'll open up just a little bit, and we are then therefore more receptive to where we're being guided. Now, the problem is people can use this for manipulation also. There's a dark wherever there's a light. But that's why I find it so important for people doing good work to understand how story works and why it's so effective, because we can't let the bad guys win. There will always be bad people taking over all of the science to move people, and they're good at it because they don't often have a lot of the inhibitors to say, oh, this isn't morally right. And so we need to understand how this works so that we know if I have somebody working with me, then that's just one less person working with somebody who might sell them a scam. So yeah, the mirror neurons are a really important part of this, but also as I mentioned, when you're guiding somebody through a transformation, you actually start that neural pathway in their mind when they're in a receptive state. And so they begin to learn with you because they're feeling with you. And then the rest becomes a lot easier because they've already kind of kickstarted that neural pathway, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that does make a lot of sense. And so now we're applying this idea of being open and vulnerable as a personal brand. But is there a line somewhere between, if you're a founder, you're a leader, are there some things that you should keep private, or do you just lay it all out there?
This is up to the person. I tend to share more than a lot of people, but I have values that speak to that. So there's a reason for that. When I was younger, I think I did just, I didn't know what to do with a lot of the things I was going through. So it was almost like I was laying it on the table. Can anyone help me with this? Before realizing that's what I was doing. But now one of my values is there's certain things where I don't like that people don't talk about things when it doesn't serve people. I think people should talk about money. I think people should talk about their miscarriages. I think, and I respect when people don't. For example, I've had some, and it's very difficult, but I also think a lot of people are suffering alone. So I'll lay out more than the average person, but you don't have to. There's still things I keep to myself. There's still things I didn't put in the book because I don't know if I want my little boys to read that about me. I don't know if I want them to know how slutty I was in my 20s because I was dealing with self-worth issues. You know what I mean? So I glaze over it. And so it's really up to you how much you want to bring to the table. You can leave 90% of it privately and still deeply connect. And there's the invitation to share more than maybe you normally would, and maybe it feels good for you. And so I recognize that people have different levels of inhibition with things, and I think that should always be honored. But I also recognize that we like to stay in our zone of familiarity, and everything's worth pushing a little bit. May or may not be for you, regardless of how much you decide to share, you can still very powerfully connect with people.
No, that makes sense. And it's tough, right? Because, you think of when you're behind your computer, somehow it feels, you sort of lose some inhibition. It feels like, I see people put things out on social media and you're like, oh, really? I'm not sure I would have said something like that. So for some people, it's would I stand up in front of a crowd and say it? Because that's kind of what you're doing online, right? And, or would I want my kids to see this? There's some sort of a of a benchmark that you can use to see if it won't come back to bite you at the end. Because as we all know, social media is forever.
Well, I would ask, why am I sharing this? What is the reason that I'm sharing this? And oftentimes that'll guide you. Another question that's good to ask is, why do I feel like I need to keep this private? And there's a lot of answers to that, and they're all valid. Oftentimes, most people wouldn't stand on a stage and say anything, let alone a story. So it's kind of hard to say, would I stand on a stage and share this? Because people are already tensing up, even if you're just asking them what they had for breakfast. Public speaking is very difficult for people. And I think that's when we look at our Facebook friends and you're like, okay, you again, why are you sharing everything? And it's because they're just emotionally vomiting kind of on their Facebook feed. And we can all feel that. So we're like, why are you dumping this on me? But then there's other people who just write beautifully, or they are sharing a lot of details of their life, but they're always bringing it back to stage 7, that wisdom, the embodiment in stage 6. Like, what did you gain from that? If you always have that, you know that you've processed it. And so oftentimes I share things less when I'm in the middle of it, when I don't know what I'm doing with it. For me, and just my role, because I talk about so much transformation and vulnerability by nature of what I do, I will share the messy middle also, because I trust that I'm going to get out of it. I trust that about myself. Me and me have developed that relationship. But I'm not going to get on my Facebook while I'm crying, while I'm deep in grief, but I might share a few days later, this week was hard. And so we have different personality types, but I think that the main thing comes back to, what's in this for the reader? Again, you can say, what's in this for me? But that's self-serving. And for me, I always get something out of when I'm sharing from the place of, how am I serving? That's reciprocal. I always get something out of that anyways. But the question is originally, how is this here to serve? And when you ask that, your guidance will usually show you your comfort levels. But again, depending on that level of inhibition, stretch it a little bit. Try, see what it's like to share something that you might have normally kept a little bit close. Doesn't need to be about an STD you're experiencing currently, but it could be about, menopause or something else that people don't talk about, and when you feel how many people lean into these taboo topics, that's when you realize, oh, this is an area that I can really create change.
Now, is that when you are starting to be more vulnerable, is that a kind of a safe place to get started? The idea of looking back on, this was a really challenging moment, but here's what I learned from it, and sharing that wisdom before you get into the messy middle of just saying, I'm having a horrible week, and because your audience might not know what to do with that.
Yeah. And do it for yourself first, because that's what I've found is when you get a handle on your own story and the wisdom it led you to, you heal through that process. And so there's a lot where we don't apply that conscious, intentional processing. And so it's still just this thing that doesn't quite feel good. Well, that's living in your body. That there's a science to that as well. And so even for yourself, there's a lot of healing to be had when you're just processing it. What did I learn from that? Who did I become from that? What would I never do again? What do I see was it from that was, why was that exactly the way I needed to learn that? And through these questions, you start to drop a lot of the shame that you have for yourself around making these stupid mistakes that you should have never made. And you have compassion for the girl that got you here, the girl who stepped in the mud and then cleaned herself off and made the steps to bring you to where you are now. And once you have that, it becomes a lot easier to share. And so, yes, it's very scary thinking, okay, tomorrow you got to go online and share about your worst thing. You don't even know what you got from this yet. That feels terrifying to anybody. But when you sit there and you're like, oh my gosh, wow, look what I did, and look how I learned, and what a beautiful thing, that makes it a lot easier.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. And what about using the power of vulnerability internally with your team? Is that because a lot of times I think we look at leaders and it's almost, the expression fearless leader, right? They're always supposed to be kind of perfect and they know everything and they give direction. And if you sound vulnerable, is your team going to get scared and think you don't know what you're doing? You can't run the company and they're going to want to leave. Like where do you draw that balance with your team?
I think of that similar to how I think of with my kids. I mess up a lot as a mom. There's moments that I lose my temper. And if I were to just beat myself up about that, neither of us would get much of that. They'd see mom too angry, then mom having shame, not really a connection between the two. But I show up, I say, listen, mommy shouldn't have raised my voice. I think there's a lot of power in that kind of vulnerability when you're a leader of a team. Hey, we tried this, and this is what we learned from it. You're guiding them through how to handle missteps, how to handle vulnerability. Maybe it's that, listen, I am taking a mental health day. 3 things happened in my family. I do not feel okay right now, and I'm going to return when I am. You give people permission to show up differently in their own lives, to handle their own issues better in ways that actually offer self-care. That is much better than just acting like nothing's going on and showing up a little stressed, snapping at people. They don't know why. This is what creates trauma in a household where you have hypervigilant kids who are on edge waiting for mommy to snap and they never really know what's going on. And so these are the kind of the different levels. I wouldn't show up with my kids and say, listen, money's really tight this month. We don't know how we're going to pay our rent. So you guys need to sit there and be good because like mommy and daddy, everything might fall apart. You're going to create nervous system issues that they will never recover from. And so you do want your team to feel safe in what you're building. But how do you model vulnerability with leadership? It's the same way if you were teaching a class on it, what would you teach? Try to model that. It's a great accountability partner for yourself. You might still have moments where you don't show up the best, but that's when mommy comes in and says, hey, I'm really sorry about yesterday. Here's what we're going to do moving forward. What did you learn from it? What was the wisdom that you gained? Who did you become from that moment that you flopped as a leader? So there's room for mistakes and there's room for fluidity, but how do you model what you're learning and the best way to show up?
Yeah, no, I love that. That sounds great. I think it's, as leaders, we still do need to be human. And I think to me, that's what you're saying is that, because we are all human, we have emotions, we're not perfect. And especially, if you're a founder and you're not in a massive organization where you have a lot of people that you can necessarily bounce ideas off of, that sometimes you are trying things out and having at least having your leadership team understand that we're all in this together and, here's what we're trying. And that thing we did before that didn't work, but, we're going in a different direction. Here's what we learned, right? Always remember the lesson. And I think that's the part that I'm hearing you say.
Exactly. And it focuses you too. Because when you start training yourself to find the lesson, you will relate to your experiences differently, even as they're happening. I mentioned how I had a couple miscarriages last year, and it was really, really hard. I had got pregnant so easily before that. I almost felt like this was just something that, it was a learning process for me. It was easy to talk about the first one. The second one, I was like, oh, I see why people keep the secret. And I had to ask myself, well, how do I really do I see that? Or is it just more messages? And so while I was going through it, I was more in that observer mindset. I trusted that I was going to get through it. I've learned a lot through my life path. And so even in my deep moments of grief, I knew I'd get out of it. I was very conscious of the meaning that I was creating from those experiences. And a lot of how I had processed my story before helped me have a higher level view from this moment right here. And that's part of why I call the stages of my process the story spiral, is because a lot of us entrepreneurs have seen that graph where it's like this up and down and up and down. The life of an entrepreneur, you've got this high and then a low and a high, but the overall trajectory is high. And I actually argue it's more like a spiral, because there's certain times where I'm like, back at the same view that I was at before. And I'm like, I thought I've already gotten past this. But what I realize is that each time you're just at a little higher perspective. You might be ready for something that you couldn't have seen the first time. And so when you learn to process your story, it does happen a little bit in real time, and it doesn't save you from the hard emotions, but it's much easier not to worry that you're going to get stuck there anymore, because you know you'll just come back around with a little higher perspective.
Yeah, and what you're saying is about being human, right? I mean, knowing that you've gone through something that was so traumatic, and knowing that you're going through grief. If you don't share that, then you're going to be, you can't hide your feelings to that extent. So rather, people are going to notice, and they probably notice more than you think they notice. And so if you're not addressing it, then they're going to wonder what's up. And the human mind tends to always go to worst case scenario, and whatever it is that's really going on, we think it's 10 times greater than that. So yeah, I absolutely respect that, and sorry that you had to go through that.
Thank you. I am reminded of, I took a public speaking intensive that was about 6 months long. And one of the things that we learned was dealing with distractions in the audience. And it's just so fitting with what you said, because we had all these exercises where we're giving our speech on stage, and then somebody's like answers the phone or drops a tray. And he was testing us on, well, what do you do in these situations? And at first people were just trying to power through, but you realize that the audience is almost more distracted if you just keep going, because they're thinking, does she know about this guy that's on the phone back here? Is she not seeing this guy over here that just dropped a tray full of wine glasses? And so then they're like split between what's actually going on, because it's almost like there's two levels of reality and they're not matching up. And so instead it's better to say, hey, will you two go help that person clean up, or addressing the person on the phone. And so the same is with these little subtleties in our lives. If you're not addressing it, it's almost more distracting for someone, because it's like the same thing that happens when you're being gaslit. Am I seeing what I'm seeing? And so all of a sudden they're in their mind trying to create a cohesive reality that's not existing on the outside, that nobody else is matching. It's like everyone's gaslighting what they're experiencing. And so when you bring voice to the subtleties, you're helping people to create a more consistent reality, which allows them to feel more comfortable in the present moment. And so there's just so many layers of why vulnerability is our greatest superpower, as cheesy as it sounds, because we're dropping the mask, we're letting go of the facade, and we're letting everybody get on the same page. And from that area, from that place, it's much easier to trust yourself, the other person, and your overall reality.
Yeah. And if you ever want to see that skill in action, watch a really good stand-up comedian. It's just,
yeah, exactly.
Have that nailed. It's like, can I help you with that call that you're taking?
Can I answer it? Yeah.
So as we're coming to the end, let's do some rapid fire wrap up. What's one belief that you've had about branding that you had to let go of?
Oh, a lot of them. I think just like most people is I spent several years thinking I couldn't compete with what was already out there. And I think it became really important, because the loudest people online are just the people that have the most presence. So the ones that you're going to see over and over again are probably steps ahead of you, years ahead of you. And so stop comparing yourself to them. One of the things that I do when I'm moving into any different market, one of the first things that I do is I actually go cleanse my feed. I'll go reset the algorithm, and I'll follow people that are 100 steps ahead of me, so I can see where I'm setting my GPS point to. But then I come back to people, okay, who only has a couple thousand followers more than I do? Who seems like they're just getting started? And I essentially brainwash myself. And so the more that you can understand about the elasticity of your brain and how you are creating what is possible for yourself by what you're experiencing, by what you're observing, then you can hack that system. And so I just think it's really important to take the steps back. Who have the messy feeds, but they still look like they're doing pretty good? Who is the most relatable to you and they still look like they're doing pretty good? Who just failed publicly and how are they handling it? Like, start looking for different things so that you're not just continuously letting yourself be programmed with this is the only way to be successful.
Love that. And give me a favorite quote that fuels your resilience.
Oh, the greatest secret of life is, this is an Alan Watts quote, but the greatest secret of life is to essentially, I forget the exact middle of the quote, but it's to forget that it's work and realize that it's play. And I remember this quite often when we look at all of the things that we have to do, even when I'm doing the dishes, and reminding myself that I get to do this. If I had just gotten out of a foreign prison, how good would the soapy water feel on my hands as I'm cleaning that burnt pot? You know what I mean? I'd probably be ecstatic about it. But we are creating all of this meaning around what we're going through and what we're creating and how much we have to do, and not really remembering or reminding ourselves that we get to do this, that all of this is just play. And so I try to remind myself of that as often as possible, because again, without that conscious direction, our programming will just take over and suddenly our to-do list is too long, we're too stressed out, and it's all of these obligations. But we essentially created them, and we're building our life this way for a reason. And if we don't like it, then what? Let's shift our mindset. Instead of just worrying about why everything sucks, where's the room for a little bit of change? What do I need in my life? And how can I pivot?
Find the silver lining, it sounds like. I love that. And lastly, if every founder did this one thing when telling their story, they'd stand out more. What is that one thing?
One thing would be, I think, connecting to the heart of the experience. What did you feel when you were going through it? What was your emotional arc from before anything happened to when something happened to afterward? Even just understanding the emotional arc that you bring somebody through or that you went through, you can craft an experience to bring somebody else to that also. But it also keeps the heart of what you're doing and why. Because it's really easy to just get caught up in all the steps of the things that we're doing. But if we're not leading with the heart, then we're just leading from the ego. And so I think it aligns in many more ways than just the connection with your audience, but it also keeps you on track to make sure that you're actually building something that you're proud of instead of just something that'll profit.
I love that. Well, look, this has been a fascinating episode, Melissa, and I know that our readers, our listeners have, I'm sure, enjoyed it and got a lot out of it. We're all trying to get our personal brands and our business brands to stand out, but you've shown us how having that heart and being vulnerable is really the best way to engage with your audience. So I thank you for that. And if our listeners want to connect with you, where can they find you?
The best place to go is mindlove.com. You can see all of my offerings there. But I also have a free gift if they are wanting to see a slightly different angle from a part in their story that they haven't quite processed. And if you go to mindlove.com/reframe, I built an AI tool that's a couple of questions long. You can write it in one word each, or you can spill out in paragraphs. It's really up to you what you want to put into that. And you'll get an email back with a personalized reframe on how this story potentially is serving you and could serve others.
Wonderful. Well, thank you for that gift. And thank you for being on the show, Melissa. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you so much for having me.